February 1943. Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. A panicked radio call cuts through the static. An American commander, his voice cracking, were being cut to pieces. In their first major battle against the Wehrmacht, U.S. forces disintegrate. German field reports confirm their prejudice. General von Arnim dismisses them as a play army, noting their very poor leadership and inability to handle combined arms. But just 5 weeks later, at a dusty crossroads called El Guettar, veterans of the 10th Panzer Division launch another attack, expecting the same easy victory. Instead, they drive into a perfectly coordinated wall of high-explosive shells erupting from the empty desert floor, shattering their attack and their confidence. This transformation from disaster to lethality was not the story of a single hero or simple revenge. It was the story of a system, adapting at terrifying speed. How did an army, dismissed by its enemy as a collection of amateurs, so rapidly develop a battlefield doctrine that stunned the most experienced military in the world? What, precisely, were German commanders witnessing in the heat of combat that their own intelligence reports had failed to prepare them for? The answer would be written in their own shocked after-action reports, and it would change the course of the war. To understand the German confidence, we have to look at what their intelligence saw, and what they saw was not an illusion. In 1941, on the eve of its entry into the war, the United States Army was the 17th largest in the world, smaller than Portugal's. It was a skeletal constabulary force scattered across the globe. During the massive Louisiana maneuvers that year, generals practiced commanding divisions that existed only on paper, using trucks borrowed from local businesses with the word tank hastily painted on the side. The attack on Pearl Harbor changed everything. America's response was not just to build an army, but to mass-produce one. In less than 2 years, a force of under 200,000 men swelled to over 8 million. But this explosive growth created an army that was profoundly green. Not just the privates, but the officers leading them. Men who were bank clerks or lawyers a year earlier were now lieutenants and captains, tasked with leading platoons and companies against the most battle-hardened military on earth. In North Africa, German observers dutifully documented the consequences. Their after-action reports, sent back to high command, were clinical and dismissive. They noted the Americans' rigid adherence to textbook plans, their reluctance to move off-road, and a critical lack of initiative among junior officers who seemed paralyzed without direct orders. The conclusion was logical. This was a second-rate opponent, a wealthy but clumsy force, utterly unlike the fanatical, hardened soldiers they faced on the Eastern Front. The pressure on the Allied command was immense. The entire strategy for invading Europe rested on the assumption that American ground forces could carry their weight. If this army couldn't learn to fight and learn at a speed unheard of in military history, the promise of a second front was in danger of catastrophic failure. Confident in their assessment, the German command in Tunisia prepared to deliver another decisive blow. They expected the Americans to make the same mistakes. They were about to be proven wrong. On the morning of March 23, 1943, the tanks of the 10th Panzer Division rolled forward. For the veteran crews, the terrain west of El Guettar felt familiar. A wide open valley. American infantry dug in on the ridges ahead. The plan was a carbon copy of their success at Kasserine, a swift, surgical armored thrust to shatter the enemy line. As the lead panzers crested the first low rise, the world simply detonated. It wasn't a scattered barrage. It was a dense, instantaneous curtain of high-explosive shells that seemed to erupt from the very ground they were crossing. The German tankers weren't just fighting infantry. They were fighting a ghost in the machine. Hidden among the GIs were small two-man teams, forward artillery observers. Armed with powerful radios, A single observer watching the German advance could summon the concentrated fire of an entire artillery group, dozens of guns, onto one map coordinate in under 3 minutes. The Blitzkrieg, built on speed and shock, had just slammed into a system built for overwhelming, on-demand destruction. The attack faltered, then broke, surviving panzers pulling back in disbelief. The Americans had held. But for the German command, a chilling question arose. Was this a fluke? Or had they just witnessed the birth of a new American way of war? The question haunted the German command as the Allies pushed from North Africa into Sicily and Italy. Guettar was no fluke. It was a preview. In the brutal, close-quarters fighting that followed, German officers began filing reports filled with a new kind of bewilderment. They were encountering a phenomenon for which their own doctrine had no answer. The American sergeant. In the Wehrmacht, command was a rigid hierarchy. When an officer fell, a unit's effectiveness often fell with him. But in American rifle platoons, something different was happening. A German machine gun would eliminate a lieutenant. The G's would take cover. But instead of panicking or waiting for orders that would never come, a new voice would cut through the chaos. A staff sergeant, a man who might have been a foreman or a mechanic 2 years prior, would crawl forward, assess the situation, and improvise. He wouldn't just give orders, he would diagnose the problem. The machine gun became a tactical equation to be solved with flanking fire, a smoke grenade, and a rifle squad. German after-action reports from Italy noted with a mix of confusion and grudging respect this surprising independence of American non-commissioned officers. They saw a battlefield culture where junior leaders treated a stalled attack not as a failure of spirit, but as a mechanical problem in need of a practical solution. This battlefield improvisation was supercharged by technology. German commanders, masters of the encirclement, soon discovered that trapping an American unit was not the checkmate it should have been. A surrounded platoon or company, cut off and facing annihilation, did not raise the white flag. Instead, it became what soldiers called a hard point. The trapped GIs would form a tight perimeter, dig in, and do something the Germans considered tactical insanity. They got on the radio. The unit's forward observer, or even just a sergeant with a map, would start calling in artillery, not on the approaching Germans, but on the American unit's own position. For a German company moving in for the kill, the result was a nightmare. The very prize they sought to capture became the epicenter of a storm of high-explosive shells. The tactical victory became a death trap. The American hardpoint acted as a self-directed beacon, pulling the entire weight of U.S. divisional artillery down on itself to break the assault. The Germans were now faced with an enemy that refused to be beaten even when beaten. An enemy who could turn a pocket of resistance into a vortex of destruction, bleeding German manpower dry. By 1944, as the fighting raged in the hedgerows of Normandy, the early German contempt had curdled into a deep and troubling confusion. Intelligence summaries sent to the highest levels of the Wehrmacht struggled to form a coherent picture. One report would criticize the Americans for unimaginative textbook tactics, while the next would express astonishment at their seamless and rapid-fire coordination. Field commanders noted the obvious softness of captured GIs, who complained about the lack of hot meals, yet they were baffled by the refusal of these same soldiers to break when cornered. Unable to see the system, the flexible NCO leadership, the networked radios, the on-call firepower, they saw only the symptom, a reliance on brute material. They concluded the American soldier was a poor fighter, propped up by an overwhelming arsenal. It was a comforting explanation, and it was dangerously wrong. The Germans were witnessing a new paradigm of industrial warfare, but they were interpreting it through the lens of their own martial traditions. They saw a crutch where they should have seen a weapon. And then there was the unseen enemy, the one no German soldier could ever truly fight: American logistics. Imagine a German grenadier in Normandy, For a week, his unit fights a bitter, costly battle to destroy an American tank platoon. They use their Panzerfausts, their courage, and their skill. They lose men, but they succeed. 3 Sherman tanks lie burning in the field. The next morning, exhausted and depleted, the German soldier looks out from his foxhole. In the exact same position are 3 more Shermans, not repaired, not salvaged, brand new. The paint barely scratched. This was the reality of the Red Ball Express and the supply chain that stretched all the way back to Detroit. For every tank lost, another was already on a ship. For every artillery shell fired, 1,000 more were being unloaded on the beaches. This ability to replace men and machines almost as fast as they were lost was more than a tactical problem. It was psychologically crushing. It created a profound sense of futility. German units could win a battle, but they could never win the war of attrition. They weren't fighting an army anymore. They were fighting a ceaseless, unstoppable torrent of material. Analyzing these reports from the front, the German High Command believed they had finally identified the American center of gravity. It was not the soldier, but his fragile morale, which they believed was entirely dependent on this endless flow of supplies and fire support. If they could just land a single, shocking blow, sever the supply lines, create chaos, and prove that the material shield could be broken, they believed the American will to fight would shatter. Based on this fatal miscalculation, they began to plan one last, desperate gamble in the West. An offensive designed not to seize territory, but to break a spirit they had fundamentally misunderstood. But this astonishing adaptation came at a staggering price. The learning curve from North Africa to the forests of Germany was not a story of tactical genius alone. It was a brutal education paid for with tens of thousands of lives. The campaigns in Sicily, Italy, and the hellish grind of the Hurtgen Forest were not elegant masterclasses. They were meat grinders, chewing up entire divisions. This exposed the chilling logic at the heart of the American war effort. Combat losses were treated as a grim form of research and development. Men and machines were expendable inputs in a vast, cold equation, replaced at a rate that was simply unimaginable to the German general staff. The American army wasn't just learning. It was a system that could afford to bleed until it figured things out. And it was this very system, this combination of individual initiative at the bottom and a near limitless capacity to absorb punishment at the top, that the Germans were about to stake everything on breaking. On December 16, 1944, the German High Command played its final card. The Ardennes offensive was a massive armored punch designed to achieve one objective: to prove their analysis correct. The entire operation was staked on the belief that a sudden, terrifying blow would sever American supply lines and shatter the fragile morale of the soft American soldier, causing a panicked, front-wide collapse. Instead, the system the Germans had so profoundly misread, now under its greatest possible stress, revealed its true nature. At frozen, vital crossroads like Saint-Vite and Bastogne, isolated American units were surrounded, outnumbered, and cut off. But they did not break. Cooks and clerks picked up rifles and held the line alongside infantry. Engineers improvised roadblocks under direct fire. And when officers fell, sergeants took command of shattered companies, organizing defenses in the chaos. Crucially, these encircled pockets of resistance became self-directed anvils. Trapped G is used their last remaining radios to call down a hurricane of artillery, not in front of their positions, but directly on top of them. The German armored spearheads, driving in for the kill, slammed into a wall of their own making, hammered to a halt by the very units they were trying to overrun. The Great Offensive, designed to shatter an army, instead shattered itself against a stubborn, decentralized resilience it could not comprehend. The war in the West was effectively lost, and it left one final, stark question. Why was the German analysis, made by some of the most experienced soldiers in the world, so catastrophically wrong. In the end, the German analysis was not wrong about what it saw. The initial after-action reports from North Africa were factually accurate. The American soldier was often tactically naive. His commanders were inexperienced. The fatal error was one of interpretation. German officers, products of a deep martial tradition, were looking for an enemy forged in their own image and judged them by their own standards of doctrinal perfection. But they weren't fighting another European army. They were fighting a civilian society mobilized for war, a culture of managers and mechanics who treated a battle not as a test of spirit, but as a technical problem to be solved with overwhelming force. The adaptable sergeant, the on-call artillery, the endless supply chain, they were all just components of a vast industrial system made manifest on the battlefield. The Germans underestimated the American soldier because they saw a man when they should have seen a factory. The German army had prepared to fight a better army. They were not prepared to fight a better factory.